Welcome back to Miniature Mashup, everybody. Today I'm taking a couple of cutesy-poo toy cars that work in a 28mm scale that I got at a garage sale and turning them into armored vehicles. If you've got any questions about the material I've used or how I did this project, go ahead and leave a comment below. I'll be sure to answer it. I'm always good about answering questions. I want you to think about Dungeons & Dragons as a tree. It had two main roots right from the beginning, and sort of where the fiction was coming from. And one of those roots was swords and sorcery, and another route was high fantasy. And they are different. And today, the route that has swollen up is the high fantasy route. D&D draws almost entirely from high fantasy and has abandoned sword and sorcery for the most part. But back in the day, early editions, it was definitely the other way around. And when we look at the tree that is modern Dungeons & Dragons, we see a ring of mushrooms growing up around it. And that's not good when you see that on a tree. That usually means that the trunk is dying. Those mushrooms that I'm referring to are a plethora of OSR games that are popping up. And the reason they're thriving is because there's a natural hunger for games that are based in sword and sorcery. After all, that is what these OSR games are trying to recreate, those earlier editions of Dungeons & Dragons. Yeah, they streamline the clunkier parts of those old D&D systems, doing away with unnecessary tables and weird idiosyncrasies wherever possible. So the question is, if they're modernizing the old rules, how is that any different from 5th edition? What does the OSR offer that can't be found in 5th edition? And I'd have to say it's, what the OSR games are trying to emulate. Many games, maybe even most games, are trying to emulate or gamify something that isn't a game. So Monopoly emulates capitalism, chess is an abstraction of the battlefield, Magic the Gathering emulates a magical duel between powerful wizards. Obviously, there's a world of licensed tabletop games based on book series, TV shows, movies, all of which try to make a gaming experience out of this other media. And what a game is trying to emulate naturally determines where the challenge of that game is found. In Monopoly, you buy properties, you develop them, you pay fines and taxes, and accumulate wealth. In chess, you command an army of soldiers and knights, and you need to protect your king. Magic the Gathering players gather mana and assault their opponents with summoned monsters and spells, and in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the RPG, you research monsters and demons, and then you hunt them down. All of these games present the players with an obvious challenge which requires a certain amount of thematic engagement in order to secure the win condition. And early D&D was no different in that it was trying to emulate the swords and sorcery literature that Gary Gygax was so fond of. So at this point, I guess I have to delve into what sword and sorcery actually is. Swords and sorcery is a subgenre of fantasy. Fritz Leiber coined the term in reference to Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. But Leiber himself also worked in sword and sorcery with his Vafford and Grey Mouser stories. Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion books, Clark Ashton Smith's Hyperborean and Mars Cycles, and so many others. It's a violent, morally gray, grim and gritty genre of speculative fiction. The heroes are typically brutal and self-interested, and while the worlds contain magic in them, it's more rare, it's more dark, and it's more dangerous than as is depicted in your typical high fantasy novel. In many ways, swords and sorcery is a genre that splits the difference between the other genres of horror and fantasy. All three are forms of speculative fiction, and so they speculate on events that are outside the realm of real-world possibility. Horror, broadly speaking, presents a nightmare scenario, and the protagonists have to try to survive it. They may, and they might not. A giant monster might rise out of the ocean, an inhuman army might have invaded, there may be an indestructible killer on the loose. Fantasy takes that nightmare scenario and turns it on its head by taking the idea a little bit further and asking, well, what if there were heroes capable of meeting these horrors head-on and defeating them? For example, what if Perseus went on a quest to retrieve the Medusa's head and then defeated the Kraken? What if Frodo went on a quest to defeat the forces of darkness by destroying the One Ring? What if Harry Potter became the greatest boy wizard and defeated the Dark Lord? Fantasy provides the same horrific scenarios as horror does, but then it writes in a hero who can do something about it. Sword and sorcery doesn't typically concern itself with world-ending events. The scale tends to be more personal. Heroes of the story are typically concerned with their own ambitions. The heroes are typically more concerned with their own ambitions. Conan, Vafford and Grey Mouser are thieves and mercenaries. Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champions, Elric and Corum, they just want to survive and they want vengeance. Often they find themselves amongst nightmarish supernatural forces, but it's rarely intentional. If they're fighting a monster, it's because something went wrong somewhere. It's in this way that sword and sorcery heroes have much more in common with the heroes of horror fiction. A very tried and true horror scenario is one of thieves or vandals who break into an old manor and find something dark and horrible waiting for them inside. The most current version of this is Abigail, a movie about a group of kidnappers who break into a house to find out their intended victim is actually a vampire. But there are tons of examples of this. Don't Breathe, The People Under the Stairs, Hell Night, Night of the Demons, The Mummy, Alien and Aliens. More than I can even list here. Conan often finds himself in this situation too. He's out to loot some ruins or burglarize a cult's temple, and inside there's a giant acid-spitting slug, or a gorilla, or a naga. Clark Ashton Smith has several tales of treasure hunters who delve into catacombs looking for wealth, but instead find an ancient evil and they're then devoured by it. This is the core of Swords and Sorcery, and the experience that Dungeons & Dragons was trying to emulate at first. In this way, Conan and early D&D characters have a lot more in common with the heroes of horror literature. That's not to say all horror has heroes. There are certainly stories that have protagonists in them, but just as often horror depicts everyday people being overwhelmed by whatever that nightmare scenario is. Often horror features characters who are tough and resourceful, but even so, that doesn't mean they can face the horror head-on in the way that a fantasy character might. Tommy Jarvis, Laurie Strode, and Ellen Ripley, they clash time and again with monsters that they have no hope of defeating physically. Monsters in horror typically can't be overcome by mundane physical means, but often they can be defeated, at least for a time, through risk management, sacrifice, and creative problem solving. The scientists figure out a way to defeat Godzilla, but people will die while implementing it. Fighting your way to Dracula during the day means you can drag him into the sunlight. We can't destroy Jason Voorhees, but we can chain him in the lake, which will at least end his killing spree for a time. Horror protagonists often have to research a way to break the curse, or what the monster's weakness is. And this is the kind of thing you can expect to do in a horror role-playing game. In Call of Cthulhu, Chill, The X-Files, Alien the role-playing game, and the like, players search for clues, conduct interviews, decipher ancient texts, and flee from monsters when unprepared. But the ultimate goal is finding the silver bullet that can defeat the evil, or at least sealing it away for a time. Early D&D wanted to emulate the experience of a group of capable but not superheroic mercenaries exploring dangerous dungeons in search of wealth. And while there was a lot of unnecessary clunkiness in those early games, they largely nailed that emulation. Characters didn't really have the moral definition they would be saddled with in later editions. Good and evil wasn't a factor in the early games, the alignment poles were simply lawful and chaotic, and this allowed players a chance to delve into more morally gray areas. Experience was based on treasure collected and not on defeating monsters, and that meant whenever possible players should avoid combats that might not end well for them. You're playing a dungeon explorer looking for treasure, you're not Blade the Daywalker exterminating a coven of vampires. Magic and magic items were very powerful, but they were also dangerous. Cursed and chaotic items abounded. Care had to be taken when using spells as they interacted with the world in a more narrative way. Every fire spell had the chance of igniting your surroundings. You could easily hurt yourself or fellow party members with a sloppily cast fireball or lightning bolt. Death and danger lurked around every corner. Traps in combat and monsters were deadly. Swords and Sorcery is grim, brutal, and the heroes don't always make it out alive. What makes Swords and Sorcery such a great genre for gaming is that it presents a challenge to the players in many different ways. They really have to engage with the situations they find themselves in, particularly in the area of creative problem solving. All of my favorite memories of 2nd edition are of the times my party came up with ingenious ways to deal with the problems presented by the Dungeon Master. Often monsters were more powerful than us, and so we had to set up the battlefield in a way that would give us the necessary edge to win. Overcoming challenges like that felt so gratifying in a way that simply beating everything to death with your sword doesn't. Now, early D&D does include some elements that are not typically found in Swords and Sorcery. The various player character races, for example, and spellcasting heroes are more typical of high fantasy. Bear in mind, Gary Gygax had to be talked into including these things in the game as they conflicted with his vision of it. He wasn't the biggest fan of Lord of the Rings, but he felt he had to include those elements because of how definitive Tolkien was on the genre of fantasy. And so Gygax made a compromise. Demi-human characters had level caps and class restrictions and were not so distant from humans in terms of their natural abilities as some of the modern race options are. There were no shapeshifters, there were no winged races. And early edition spellcasters were very different from their modern counterparts also. They were incredibly fragile, and all they could do for the first few levels is try not to die. It's not until level 6 or 7 that they even begin to feel like spellcasters as we think of them in popular culture. Most of the time, they really were more akin to students of arcane lore, a character archetype that is much more in keeping with the Sword and Sorcery genre. In comparison to modern iterations of Dungeons & Dragons, there were a lot more challenges to overcome overall. Your party wasn't a group of bigger-than-life superheroes killing trolls for fun and profit. They were human characters skulking through dark and dangerous dungeons, which meant they had to plan and strategize. And if you're going to get together with a bunch of friends, don't you want to plan and strategize? They could achieve that great power that they have today in the modern game eventually, but in order to get there, they had to survive, and in order to survive, they had to make choices. And making choices that have consequences is what interesting gameplay is all about. The superheroes of the modern game don't really have to make choices, there just aren't the same stakes. And I find the modern game to be very one-dimensional in that way. And I'm not alone, which is why we're seeing such a rise and return of OSR. Anyway guys, thank you for listening to my little ramble and rant about sword and sorcery versus high fantasy in the world of Dungeons and Dragons and how it applies. If you enjoyed listening to me today, please leave a like and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. Check out my Facebook page. I've got an eBay store as well and Instagram. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks guys. Bye.